There is a street plan in a pine forest on the Baltic island of Usedom. Curbstones, drains, and a flight of steps going up to nothing. 12,000 people worked at the plant those streets served, and the town along them was as modern as anything in Germany. Then the Royal Air Force came for it on the night of the 17th of August, 1943. The Reich built settlements for its rocket and atomic work, then wiped them off its own maps. 10 of them here. Number 1 is that town on Usedom, and it was called Karlshagen. The first place on the list was picked because there was nothing there, and nothing is roughly what it holds now. In 1936 it was heath, sheep, and a branch line. Number 10, Trauen, on the Lüneburg Heath, Germany. Drive south from Munster and the pine closes in, and behind a steel gate you find single-storey buildings with the windows gone, concrete foundations under moss, and iron staircases rusting into the sand. In 1936, the Reich Air Ministry hired an Austrian engineer called Eugen Seinger, who had been running combustion chamber tests in Vienna, to build a rocket institute for the Luftwaffe. The Air Force wanted its own rocket program, entirely separate from the Army's, which by then was run by Walter Dornberger and a young Werner von Braun. So Seinger got the Heath. The site was given the cover name Flugzeugprüfstelle Trauen, the Trauen Aircraft Testing Station, and that name was used against the Army Weapons Office as well as the enemy. What went up there was the first liquid oxygen tank installation in the world, and a test stand for engines nobody else was allowed to see. Seinger's solution to the heat problem, running the fuel around the nozzle to cool it before burning it, is in almost every rocket engine flying today. But the laboratory closed in March 1942, officially over fuel shortages, in practice because Seinger and his superiors could not stand each other. The big test stand was demolished after the war. Europa rocket upper stages were fired there in the 1960s, and when that program was cancelled, the place was left to the Heath again. The German Aerospace Centre still owns it. Half the office block has been refitted with modern electronics. The other half still has the hand-flush lavatories that were fitted in 1936. Seinger lost that race. The people who won it started 25 kilometers south of Berlin on a range that had been blowing things up since the 1870s. Number 9. Kummersdorf-Gut, Brandenburg, Germany. 25 kilometers south of Berlin, there is a village, a pine forest, and inside the forest, a set of concrete test stands with the roofs gone and the trees growing through them. The Prussian government signed for the land on the 28th of June 1875 and built a military railway 45.5 kilometers long to reach it from Berlin, running 2 trains a day, open to the public. By the 1880s, the range ran 13 kilometers through uninhabited pine. In 1930, Dornberger started the Army's rocket work here. Von Braun joined him in 1932, aged 20, and by December 1934 they had put an A2 to about 2 kilometers. It was not a clean start. On the 16th of July 1934, a fuel tank exploded during a test of a pre-mixed hydrogen peroxide and alcohol propellant, and it killed Dr. Kurt Warmke and 2 of his assistants. But the range was too small and too close to a capital city for what came next. So in 1936, the rocket group left for the Baltic coast, and Kummersdorf went back to tanks, guns, and, from 1939, nuclear physics. The Red Army held the site until 1994. The whole thing has been a protected monument since 2007. You still cannot walk in on your own because the ground is full of unexploded ammunition, and the only legal way through is a booked tour on paths that have been cleared and checked. A few kilometers away, in the same forest, the army was building something that is not on the tour. Number 8. Gottow, Brandenburg, Germany. What is left at Gottow is a squared-off hollow of steel and concrete in the trees, filled with leaves. Its full name was the Chemical, Physical and Atomic Testing Station Gottow, and it belonged to Kummersdorf under an army department blandly titled Special Equipment. It was run by Dr. Kurt Diebner, a physicist from Obernessa, and it was where Germany came closest to a working reactor. The first attempt used 6,800 cubes of uranium oxide, about 25 tons of it, stacked in paraffin. In the spring of 1944, the experiment logged as G3B used 564 kilograms of uranium cubes and just under 600 litres of heavy water, and produced a neutron increase of 106%, which was better than anything the rival group in Berlin had managed. The uranium came from the WWII works at Oranienburg. The heavy water came from Vemork in Norway, which is why the Norwegian sabotage raids mattered so much. Then, in the autumn of 1944, Diebner started another experiment, and something went wrong. The circumstances have never been established. There was an accident, staff were exposed to radiation, and by modern rules it would have been reportable. The order to clear the site came on the 20th of April, 1945. The Soviets shipped the laboratory east as reparations, villagers took what was left, and troops blew up most of the buildings and put an ammunition depot on top. The German Federal Radiation Protection Office measured the ground in February and March of 2000 and found slightly raised activity over a patch about 15 meters square, caused by natural uranium in the soil, and no contamination dangerous to health. Diebner did not wait for any of that. In the summer of 1944, he moved his uranium to Thuringia and put it in the cellar of a school. Number 7. Stadtilm, Thuringia, Germany. Stadtilm is a small town in the Ilm Valley with a market square, a church, and a river running through it. In front of one particular vaulted cellar, there is a fountain shaped like a polished steel cube, which is as close as a German town gets to a joke about uranium. The bombing of Berlin had forced the dispersal of everything that mattered, and a search across Thuringia found a school building here with deep cellars underneath it, the old vaults of a malt house. Diebner and a group of around 10 scientists moved in during the autumn of 1944 with the uranium cubes from Gottow, set up laboratories and a workshop, and began preparing a spherical arrangement they thought would beat the Berlin design. Lessons carried on upstairs the whole time. The town's own chronicle is blunt about this and says the stories about the school being cleared for the physicists are nonsense. More than 10 tons of uranium oxide sat under those classrooms. Then Diebner and Werner Heisenberg spent a month arguing about whether the last big experiment should happen in Thuringia or in the south, which is a month nobody in that program had. Heisenberg won, took his material south and left Diebner with a stockpile and no experiment. The Americans arrived in April 1945 and found the laboratory. The physicists had already gone, driven towards Munich under SS escort. The school itself was destroyed at the end of the war, but the malt vaults under it survived, and you can stand in them. If you are enjoying these, hit subscribe, because we are working through a version of this list for every country in Europe. Number 6 is the one place where the physics very nearly worked, and it is underneath a church. While Diebner was arguing about school cellars in Thuringia, another group had already rented a pub cellar 300 kilometers to the southwest and had been quietly fitting it out for a year. Number 6, Haigerloch, Baden-Württemberg, Germany. Haigerloch sits in a tight limestone gorge on the river Iach, with a castle church on a rock above the houses and a plain door cut into the rock face underneath it. On the 29th of July 1944, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute rented the beer and potato cellar behind that door from the Schwanen Inn for 100 Reichsmark a month. Walter Gerlach had studied at Tübingen and knew the area was quiet, hard to bomb, and unlikely to see a Soviet soldier. Inside, in a concrete cylinder, Heisenberg's team built the 8th and last of their Berlin experiments. 664 cubes of uranium metal strung on aircraft cable, hanging in a tank of heavy water inside a shield of graphite. They assembled it between the end of February and April 1945, and it worked in the sense that neutrons multiplied and did not run away. It needed roughly half as much uranium again to go critical, and that uranium was sitting in a school cellar in Thuringia that Heisenberg could not get at. So they took it apart. The cubes were buried in a field, the heavy water went into barrels, the important papers went into a latrine, and Heisenberg left on a bicycle with cubes in his rucksack. American troops entered Haigerloch on the 23rd of April, opened the cellar the next day, dismantled the pile, and blew up the vessel. 10 of those cubes have since turned up in American collections, in universities and private hands. And for most of them, nobody can fully explain the journey. From here down, the list stops being about laboratories. The next 4 places were built by people who were worked to death building them, and the town waiting at the end of it is the reason the other 3 exist at all. Number 5. Lehesten, Thuringian Slate Mountains, Germany. Above the village of Schmiedebach, there is a slate quarry called the Oertelsbruch, and most of it is now a lake. Slate has been cut here since the 13th century, and the houses in the valley are roofed with it. On the 15th of September 1943, 4 weeks after the raid on Peenemünde, the army signed a lease on the quarry. Martin Schilling, who ran testing on the Baltic, had chosen the site, and 400 engineers came south with the paperwork. The plan was to make liquid oxygen underground and to test rocket engines in the open pit. Engines built in the Nordhausen tunnels were shipped here, bolted to vertical stands high on the quarry wall, and fired straight down into the hole, which meant nobody had to build a blast shield. Oxygen production and combustion chamber calibration began in January 1944. 9 oxygen machines were running by March, and 3 more arrived in January 1945. The tunnels were dug by prisoners. From September 1943, the SS held them in the farm buildings beside the quarry, in a Buchenwald subcamp code named Laura, and more than 2,600 men from over 10 countries passed through it. Up to 600 at a time slept in one barn. The site was evacuated on the 13th of April 1945. American experts ran the stands first. Then the Soviets took over, kept firing engines here until the spring of 1946, assembled a complete A4, and shipped the 2 vertical stands wholesale to Zagorsk. Slate was cut here until 2009. In September of that year, a Dutchman named Herman van Hasselt, who survived Laura at the age of 20, was buried at the memorial in the barn at his own request. 50 kilometers northwest of that quarry, the same organization was digging something far larger, and to this day, nobody can say what for. Number 4. The Jonastal, near Ohrdruf, Thuringia, Germany. The Jonastal is a narrow limestone valley between Krauwinkel and Arnstadt, with a road through it and a stream. In the north wall there are concrete portals, walled up, some with steel plates across them, most with brambles growing over the top, and a warning sign bolted to the concrete. The code name was Sonderbauvorhaben 3. Work began in the late summer of 1944 next to a communications bunker. The Wehrmacht had already started there in the 1930s. 25 tunnels went into the hillside in 4 groups, more than 2,000 meters of them driven. Individual tunnels up to 160 meters long, and about 620 meters already lined with concrete, which tells you it was meant to be permanent. There were field railways, water pipes, ventilation plant and pumping stations. All of it was dug by concentration camp prisoners. The German SS set up the Ohrdruf subcamp of Buchenwald in November 1944, and by the end of the year it held over 10,000 people. By the end of March 1945, around 20,000 had passed through, mostly Russians, Poles and Hungarian Jews. The Buchenwald Memorial states that between the 20th of November 1944 and the 5th of April 1945, Ohrdruf claimed far more than 7,000 lives. Nobody has ever produced a document saying what the tunnels were for. An underground seat of government is the likeliest answer, and it is still an answer with a question mark on it. The SS began marching the prisoners out on the 1st of April. American troops reached the camp on the 4th, which made Ohrdruf the first concentration camp liberated in the West, and Eisenhower came to see it himself on the 12th. The pattern here is a valley chosen because it was empty. 700 kilometers east, the SS had gone one better and made the emptiness itself. Number 3, Pustków, Subcarpathia, Poland. East of Debeka, in the forest triangle between the Vistula and the San, there are concrete slabs, ring roads and rectangles of foundation running through the pines, with a memorial and a cemetery in a clearing. Under an armed forces order dated the 21st of December 1939, Himmler was given this stretch of occupied Poland for an SS training ground. It was laid out as a barrack camp with 4 ring roads. To clear the ground, the inhabitants of about 15 villages were evicted and their houses burned. The labour camp opened in June 1940 with Jewish prisoners and Belgian prisoners of war, and conditions were such that most of the first arrivals did not survive their first months. The range changed name 3 times, from Ostpolen to Haigerloch in July 1941 and to Debeka in March 1943, which is the sort of thing an organisation does when it wants its paperwork to lead nowhere. Troops trained here for the Waffen-SS, including a Ukrainian division and units from Estonia, and were used on the surrounding villages. The memorials on the site record around 15,000 dead at the Pustków camps, 7,500 of them Jews, 5,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and 2,500 Poles. What grew up next to it was a work settlement, Pustków Osiedl, built for the range. Then, in the autumn of 1943, the rocket people arrived, and the camp became the labour supply for the site at the centre of the range. It is worth being exact about this. The launch pads, the concrete roads, and the narrow gauge railway at the next place on this list were built by the men from Pustków. Number 2, Blizna, Subcarpathia, Poland. Blizna is a village in the woods, and the site is a clearing with concrete pads, a bunker, and a small museum, reached down a lane that gives no clue what is at the end of it. The rockets came here because the Baltic coast had stopped being safe, which is the story of number 1. The first A4 went up from Blizna on the 5th of November 1943, and by the early summer of 1944 they were firing up to 10 a day. Alongside it, the Germans built a fake village. Empty wooden houses, barns, laundry hung on lines, and model animals in the fields, so that anything photographing them from above would see farmers. It did not work, because the farmers were real somewhere else. The Home Army had an intelligence network across the Debeka district, watching the trains, and the possession of a single missile fragment carried a death sentence. Rockets kept coming down around Sarnaki, on the River Bug. On the night of the 20th of May, 1944, one arrived almost intact in the marshes, and villagers hid it under reeds before the Germans could reach it. It was taken apart and moved to Warsaw in farm carts. Janusz Groszkowski worked on the guidance, Marceli Struszyński on the fuel, Bogdan Stefanowski on the engine. On the night of the 25th of July, an RAF Dakota of 267 Squadron flew up from Brindisi, landed on a field near Walruda, sank into the mud, was dug out by partisans, and took off with the parts on board. 2 days later, they were in London. The Germans left Blizna at the end of that month, and the Red Army arrived on the 6th of August, 10 days behind them. Every dispersal on this list, the quarry, the school cellar, the fake village in Poland, traces back to one night on the Baltic coast in August 1943 and to the town that was standing underneath it. Number 1. Karlshagen, Usedom, Germany. Walk into the pine woods behind the dunes at Karlshagen, and the ground starts making sense, in a way woodland should not, because there are curbstones under the needles, right angles in the undergrowth, drain covers, and a set of steps going up to a house that is not there. At the old settlement station, there is a pedestrian underpass, flooded now, that once brought thousands of people out onto 3 platforms. From 1936, the army built the largest military research centre in Europe on the north tip of this island, and from 1937 it built a town to run it. There were terraced houses along Hindenburgstrasse, a department store with a bookshop, a butcher, a dairy and a hairdresser inside it, a school that opened in 1941 for all the children on the peninsula, and a station finished in 1942 where staff and their families travelled free because the whole peninsula was a restricted zone and nobody else was getting on that train. 12,000 people worked at the plant by 1943. The other half of the town is not in the photographs. Prisoners from Buchenwald were brought in that year and held in a camp at Karlshagen, on average around 1,200 of them at a time, working 10-hour days in the eastern works. And there was a labour camp at Trassenheide holding thousands of foreign workers. On the night of the 17th of August 1943, 596 British bombers came in under a full moon and dropped 1,593 tons of high explosive and 281 tons of incendiaries. The markers fell short. The first wave went into Trassenheide, where the foreign workers were behind wire and could not get out, and between 500 and 600 of them died there. Then the correction came through, and the town got the rest. Around 3/4 of the housing was destroyed. The order to evacuate the women and children had already been given. It had been postponed and postponed again. They were still there when the first wave came in. Karlshagen's own chronicle records about 700 dead. Walter Thiel, the engine specialist, was killed with his family in a slit trench. The RAF lost 40 aircraft and the men in them. The programme was set back by weeks, and the work went to Poland, to Thuringia, to the quarry and the tunnels and the fake village, which is the entire rest of this list. The settlement was built to serve a weapon designed to fall on other people's streets. Its own streets went first. What survived the war was demolished afterwards, under the demilitarization terms, and the peninsula went to the East German Army as a training ground. A few streets of houses still stand in the resort of Karlshagen. The rest of the plan is under the pine trees, and there are still unexploded bombs in that ground, so the signs ask you to stay on the path. That is the pattern across all 10. The Reich went looking for empty places, and where a place was not empty enough, it emptied it, by eviction at Pustków, by fence and permit at Kummersdorf, by burning villages in a Polish forest. Then it lost, and the winners took the machinery, the paperwork and the physicists, and left the concrete behind for the trees. Which is why almost none of it looks like anything until you know what you are standing on. A flooded quarry in Thuringia, a square hollow in a Brandenburg pine wood, a door in a rock under a Swabian church, and a street plan in the sand on Usedom, with the drains still in it. 8 of the 10 are reachable today, and the 2 in Brandenburg are shut for the plainest reason there is, which is that the ground is still full of live ammunition 80 years on. Subscribe and we will go and find the next 10. Thank you.